So, what happens when a song, one of those tunes that basically defines a generation, gets co opted by a political movement the artist absolutely despises? We're talking about these huge, iconic rock anthems, the soundtrack to so many Australian lives, and suddenly they've been blasted at political rallies that make their creators just see red. It's a massive culture clash. So, how did this whole thing kick off? Yeah, it's a really fascinating situation, right? You've got these legendary musicians on one side, and on the other, you have these populist political groups who are absolutely convinced these anthems speak directly for them and their supporters. So the big question here is, how did we even get to this point? And maybe more importantly, who actually gets to decide what a song really means? Okay, so let's start with the artist's side of things. And really, to say they weren't happy would be the understatement of the year. We're talking about some of Australia's biggest musical names coming out very publicly and very forcefully demanding that these political groups stop using their music, period. So here are the key players in this whole drama. First up, you've got the Hoodoo Gurus and their classic What's My Scene, which was being used by the nationalist political party, One Nation. Then, of course, there's the unofficial Aussie anthem Down Under by Men at Work, which popped up at events for a group called March for Australia. And last but not least, you have Jimmy Barnes' legendary ballad Working Class Man, getting played at rallies for Reclaim Australia. So yeah, in every single one of these cases, the battle lines were drawn pretty darn quick. And listen, the artists, they did not hold back. The Hoodoo Gurus, for example, they dropped one of the most savage statements you will probably ever see from a band. They didn't just disagree. They came out and basically said, "We want nothing to do with you." I mean, there is zero room for interpretation there. It's about as blunt as you can get. Now, Colin Hay from Men at Work, he went a slightly different route. A bit more formal, you could say, but just as firm. He made it crystal clear that he strenuously disapproved of it all. So the main takeaway here is pretty simple. The folks who actually wrote and performed these anthems, they are completely 100% against their music being used this way. But, that's only one side of the coin. The source material we're digging into today flips the script completely. It presents this really sharp counterargument, and it levels a pretty serious charge against these musicians: hypocrisy. Right, so the core argument from the commentator is basically this. These artists, who the source calls pampered pop stars, are accused of turning their backs on the very culture that made them famous. The whole working class, patriotic vibe that, according to the source, made them rich, they're rejecting it. It's a really provocative claim, so let's unpack it a little. So according to this viewpoint, these musicians basically cashed in on what's called Aussie culture back in the 70s and 80s. That very Aussie, working class pride. They channeled it, turned it into huge hits, and made a fortune. The argument goes that they sang about hard work and struggle, but never actually did a day of manual labor themselves. And here's the kicker. The source claims that a lot of their original fans, well, they're the same people who are now supporting these political groups. And that brings us to what the source points to as the ultimate example of this whole irony. It all comes down to one of the most iconic Aussie songs of all time. Okay, so Jimmy Barnes, he's the absolute symbol of the Aussie working class hero, right? And he's also one of the artists who protested his music being used. But the source zeroes in on his signature song, Working Class Man, to unveil a connection that it says is so ironic you just couldn't make it up. All right, check this out, because this is the core of the source's whole argument. Just follow the breadcrumbs here. 1. The ultimate anthem for the Aussie battler, Working Class Man. It wasn't actually written by Jimmy Barnes. 2. It was written by an American musician named Jonathan Cain. 3. Who's Jonathan Cain? He's the keyboardist for the legendary rock band Journey. And 4. Here's the twist. Jonathan Cain is a very public, very vocal supporter of Donald Trump. And this isn't some vague connection either. The source points out that Cain has literally performed for Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. His wife has even worked for the Trump administration. So the source draws this straight line between Trump's political platform, promising to slash immigration to appeal to working class voters, and the exact kind of sentiment that's fueling the Australian groups that Jimmy Barnes is now protesting. Which is why the commentator uses that exact phrase. You couldn't make it up. The idea that Australia's ultimate working class anthem, a song being used by nationalist groups, was actually written by a supporter of an American president with a very similar political platform. Wow. That's presented as the absolute height of irony. So, if we take a step back from this specific Aussie culture clash for a second, this whole situation really makes you think, doesn't it? It brings up a much bigger, much more universal question about art and who gets to own it. And that's really the big question I want to leave you with. When a song becomes more than just a song, when it becomes an anthem, who really gets to decide what it means? Is it the artist who created it, or is it the audience that adopts it, that sings it in stadiums and at rallies, and makes it their own? Who gets the final say? It's a tough one, and there's definitely no easy answer.